We are now recording. So again, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Enterprise Agile Meetup or community. We've grown significantly over the pandemic. It's kind of odd. I guess it's virtual. It's cool. And we've had a lot of wonderful guests to share their ideas and their thinking and basically, you know, how to improve and evolve our agile ecosystem and knowledge. Like I said, we focus mostly on large companies and how to do agile transformation adoption at scale, at complexity in that regard. So welcome everyone. We have 1 to 2 of these sessions per month. And now I'm going to turn it over to my friend Gopal. And Gopal is going to introduce our fabulous speaker for tonight. Gopal, it is on to you now.
Thank you, Jay. I apologize. I cannot be on video. Just trying to juggle a personal thing that's going on my side. But I am super excited today because Lisa has accepted our invitation, and she has, generously donating her time today, come and speak to us about the next iteration of Agile. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Lisa and then hand it over to her. So Lisa has been, played different roles in the industry. She has been, worked for big companies, small companies, and she currently is a principal at one of a major Agile firms that does consulting work. They also do a lot of, thought leadership on Agile as well. And she has co-authored a book called Agile 2. So we're going to listen to her and get the nuggets of wisdom from her about the next iteration of Agile, which is the theme of that book. If you don't have a copy of the book, I would recommend you get it. And, I also will make a note here. Lisa and her partners are available for any consulting work. So if you guys are interested in taking your company and evolving your Agile maturity, she is absolutely available, and her partners are available, co-partners are available as well. A couple of small notes. She is fluent in French. She didn't tell me, but I looked it up, Lisa. So, and then she can decorate Ukrainian eggs. That's what I saw, Lisa. Maybe you can talk to us about that.
Yeah, you did your research. I'm impressed.
Yes. And these are, if you guys don't know, these are very traditional, and, it's part of the culture of Ukraine. And she does that. She has done that for many years. So maybe, the next presentation may be about the Ukrainian eggs. And I don't want to spell, it's, that whole, genre is called something. I don't want to, butcher that, what you call it. The dressing, it has got a special name. So at this point, Lisa, I want to hand this over to you. Thank you,
Thanks.
Lisa.
I'm very impressed that you dug that up. Years ago, I got into this hobby of decorating Ukrainian eggs and wrote a book about how to make them and taught classes and was all into it. Haven't done that in over 10 years. So yeah, but it was a lot of fun. Well, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to speak to all of you. Today, what I'm going to do is present for a bit, but I'd like to invite you to go ahead and post questions in the chat. And if you feel comfortable asking your question out loud, that would be fine too. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat, but I'm probably going to miss a lot. So our moderators tonight will find those and call them out to me if I miss something. And then after the presentation, we'll open it up for some general Q&A. So I'm going to start with a slide that I borrowed from my colleague, Cliff. He did a wonderful talk in February at the Agile 20 Reflect Festival called Why Agile Needs a Hard Pivot. And the theme of that talk is a catalog of the things that I think probably everyone here knows about already that are not quite working the way they need to be, right? All the things that we talk about. So if you ask an Agile coach how things are going, typically they'll say, you know, things are going really well. But if you check in with developers, if they're honest with you and they trust you, they'll give you a different story. Some of them tolerate Agile, but some of them outright just can't stand it. And some people find that they have Agile processes and Agile approaches imposed upon them, and it doesn't work for their type of work. And they feel frustrated by that. And they kind of equate Agile with Scrum. So if you say to somebody, how's Agile doing? They immediately start talking about their pain points, and you realize that all of those pain points are coming from Scrum. And as we all know, Scrum is not equal to Agile, but people do think that. And then if you check in with executives, especially those who have a technical background, they feel frustrated because they're trying to get teams to work in a coordinated fashion and follow some kind of architecture plans or technical strategy. And teams want more autonomy and freedom to choose their tools, but also to choose their, in some cases, choose their architecture. And so the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and things are breaking. And, you know, I used to work in the federal government, which is huge. And you know, this was a really common occurrence where it was, you know, the idea of these Agile teams meant that individual teams felt that they had more autonomy, and it would cause problems with the technical strategy. So,
Lisa, do you think you're sharing slides? Because you're not.
Oh, well, you know what? I appreciate your speaking up and telling me that. Now I'm going to share my beautiful slides. I had everything all queued up too.
Just as a thought. Thanks.
Here we go. All right, so now you're gonna laugh when you see this ridiculous slides. Okay, so this is the intro one. All right, so here's the Agile coach. Okay, so we had little cartoons. I'm gonna go through these pretty quickly because I already talked through them. Here's the developer. You go to the developer and they're like, you know, if they really are honest with you, they'll say, I just can't stand it. Well, some of them will say that, not all of them. And this is the machine learning expert who says, you know, the Scrum doesn't understand my work, or my work doesn't fit into a Scrum framework. I hear this from our data scientists, and I feel their pain. It kind of makes sense sometimes in our data analysts. And then this is the vice president of engineering who's frustrated with Agile. So, and I'm sure all of you have stories, right? Stories like this. I mean, I think anyone who's experienced, anyone I've talked to who's experienced with Agile, who's been around for a while, has stories like this, either that they've experienced themselves, or they've heard from other people, or they've heard from their clients. You know, Agile's not working for me. It's really frustrating. You know, what am I going to do? And, you know, a common pattern that we see is an organization will decide to undertake a digital transformation, and they'll bring in a large consulting company to help them. Very expensive. They're there for 6 months and then they leave. And then 6 months later, things have sort of drifted and things are kind of confusing and they don't know what to do. And so they might bring in, decide to bring in another group of consultants with SAFe. And so they do a big SAFe implementation, and they do that across the organization. And again, you know, it kind of helps, but it also can, you know, kind of causes some problems and gets confusing. And organizations are like, you know, really frustrated. And when you talk to people making these decisions about what type of transformation to do, they'll say, you know, Agile just doesn't work. We're just really frustrated with it. And so, you know, and people in Agile coaches talk about this all the time, enterprise Agile coaches, it's written about in the blogs. I mean, this isn't new, right? I'm not telling you anything you probably don't already know. But what we did was we got together and we talked about this and tried to say, well, what could we do? how can we help this situation? And we put all of our ideas on the website, agile2.net, last fall. And that's where we talk about our values and principles. And
I mean, you have to choose. Do you think being there for NIFA is more important?
What's that?
No, go down this weekend.
Oh, I think this is
on next. But
can you go on mute?
Health, it would be better to go down this weekend.
All right. Jay, can you put them on? Oh, you did. Okay. All right. Happens to all of us, God knows. Okay, so if you go to the, by the way, these are all links in the slide deck that I posted in the chat. So if you open up the slide deck, you can click on these links. We have a LinkedIn group where people talk about their opinions and thoughts and reactions to the book. And then there's also a link to Cliff's talk on why Agile needs a hard pivot. So I'll tell you a little bit about how this all got started. Cliff has been writing about these topics for a while and put out a call on LinkedIn and said, hey, everyone and anyone who's really serious about these things and really concerned about the future of Agile and why things aren't working and why coaches go around and say things like, all Agile transformations fail, which obviously they don't, but it's like shorthand for saying, yeah, this is hard and we're struggling and sometimes it's not working. And it's very frustrating for the consulting companies because they come in and they try to help, but they're there for a short period and they leave. And then if things don't work out, they get blamed, but actually it's not their fault. And, it just becomes a very complicated situation. So we wanted to get a cross section of people together. And so Cliff reached out to some people and others just volunteered. And we really had a pretty wide range. We had data folks, we had some software engineers, we had someone from HR or people operations, we had several Agile coaches, we had experts in product design, experts in DevOps, several very technical people were in this group. And our process was to communicate mostly by email and then eventually in Google Docs. And we just had this incredibly deep, rich intellectual exchange of ideas. And at first it was a lot of criticism, like Agile's not working because of all these negative things, right? And then as we talked about some of that stuff, but then we said, okay, but what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to help our industry move things forward and really help our clients and keep Agile working well? And how do we fix this? And where we ended up was a series of principles and values and principles, really. We just got together and things sort of started to coalesce. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. There are a lot of them. And I know there's a lot of them, but they there were like more than twice as many when we started. So we got them down. But if you've been working, which I assume you all have been working in this space for a while, you know how complex it is. And you know how hard it is. And you know that you come in and there's not a recipe and there's not a list, a checkbox. You can just do all the things and poof, you're Agile. You know all these things, right? So what we were trying to do here was distill and articulate ideas that have been out and about in the community for a while. So they're not completely brand new. We didn't create a brand new anything. What we did was we gathered together some really bright minds and lots of existing thought on this topic and pulled it together into a coherent philosophy. So before I talk about the Agile 2 values, I want to talk a little bit quickly about the Agile values. Somebody have a question? I hear someone talk and then I think someone has a question. Sorry. All right.
So sorry, Lisa. It's a constant thing for me. I have to keep watching people and mute them. because they come on and I have to mute them. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I totally understand. I just don't want to talk over anyone if they're trying to ask a question. So, all right.
Just let me tell everybody, I'm sorry, Lisa. Everyone, make sure you're on mute. If you have a question, send it in the chat. We'll have Q&A at the end.
Okay. All right. So we're all familiar with this. There's a very important caveat at the bottom of this statement. While there is value in the items on the right, and that all important caveat often gets overlooked. So what happens is in the balance between these two, people instead focus on over. So instead of thinking of this as a balance between things that have relatively equal value, but we value one a little bit more, or maybe a lot more than the other, but still we recognize that there is value in processes and tools. We just value individuals and interactions more, but it doesn't mean we don't value processes and tools at all. It means we don't value it as highly, right? And that often gets overlooked. It's a very common misunderstanding. And so when people create visualizations and put them on slide decks and are talking about the agile values and principles, they always create this type of, not always, very often, create statements that just show these as we value these things over these things. And what that has led to is such a misunderstanding that when people write new manifestos in other realms, they will carry forward this concept of good, bad, right, wrong, and they'll write manifestos where the items on the left are clearly good and the items on the right are clearly bad, right? And they completely drop the whole concept of we value both, we just value these more. So they sort of dropped the balance that's, I think, was inherent in the original Agile manifesto statements. And the ideas, you know, and the criticism of these things is not really new. I mean, this is, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, but this is from 2012. And this is written by, you know, software developers who were, or engineers, or people who were just really frustrated by having Agile imposed on them and being told, you know, this is how you have to work. So here in the value statements, they went ahead and changed it to individuals and interactions and not processes and tools and so forth, right? Working software and not comprehensive documentation. So again, I want to emphasize, you know, these Agile 2 ideas are not new. We're just articulating a new set of values and principles that reflect what we're hearing in the community. So when we created our own value statements, we applied polarity thinking. And for those of you who aren't familiar with polarity thinking, it's this idea of constant movement, right? That things swing back and forth.
What are you looking for?
And there's a balance. And when you have too much of one thing, it's not that thing that you have, like in this case, this example is rest in action, right? So you have a lot of activity and you get to a point where you have too much activity and you're exhausted and you're tired, and so you need to rest. And then you rest and then you go back to activity. And so you go back and forth between the two, and one isn't bad or good, one isn't right or wrong. They're in balance with each other. They can't necessarily be compatible at the same point in time, but there is a sense of both of them are okay and they just need to be in balance with each other. And so what we tried to do when we were thinking about our value statements was to bring back that sense of balance. And the way that we decided to do that was to use both and phrasing instead of or over. And so we, in our statements, say we value both of these things. And we don't really go into detail about why one might be better or worse than the other. Essentially, what we're saying is that they're both valuable, and depending on the circumstances and depending on what you're dealing with, they're both needed. So these are our values. I was a philosophy major in college, and I wrote my senior honors thesis on moral philosophy. And that was, you know, back when I knew everything about everything, and really enjoyed digging into morality and ethical concepts. And when I first encountered Agile, to be honest with you, what really drew me to it were the values and principles, the idea that there's this bedrock, that there's this stable, solid philosophy, that this isn't just somebody's idea of, oh, this is a nice idea or this is a good process, but that there was actually I felt a real sort of philosophical depth and a morality to the whole system that really appealed to me. And, you know, when I was young, it was easy to divide the world into good and bad and right and wrong. And the older I've gotten and the more experienced I've gotten, the more I'm capable of seeing the gray areas and realizing that things are rarely what they seem, and that almost nothing is all good or all bad. And that we need to be aware of the gradations, right? We need to be sensitive to the variations in levels of, now I'm getting a little lost here, but basically what I want to say is we need to be able to see the balance between the light and the darkness, and to find our way in between them like we're walking on a tightrope. And the only way to do that is to be mindful of our context all the time, and to allow space for really deep complexity. So some of these statements might seem like they're contradictory or they're opposites, like thoughtfulness and prescription. Well, we value both. We've all been in situations where we're dealing with a junior team of people who have never done Agile before, and they might be really good at software engineering, but they're just not really sure how to work together. And a team like that needs some prescriptive guidance on how to get started, because they don't know what they're doing. And if you tell them, just go read the Scrum Guide and figure it out, usually that doesn't turn out very well. And so in some cases, in some situations, prescriptiveness is really important and needed, but it needs to be done and offered in a way that's very thoughtful and that takes into account the context of the situation. Same thing with outcomes and outputs. You know, you hear a lot in Agile space, like the only thing that matters is outcome and so forth. And I agree, outcomes are the most important thing because it's the only reason we're doing anything. But you don't get outcomes without outputs. Like there has to be some output in order to get to the outcomes that you seek. And paying attention sometimes to the outputs can help you achieve your outcomes. And so outputs aren't a bad thing. They're not the point, they're not the goal, but they might need to be attended to, measured, discussed as part of your journey to get the outcomes that you seek. Now, individuals and teams, as a group, collectively, we feel like the emphasis in the Agile community has been much more on teams, and that the individual kind of got lost in the shuffle there a little bit. And we all had stories from different perspectives. By the way, this group of people was from around the world. There were people on lots of different continents. It wasn't just the United States. But it was interesting because they had similar stories about how individual differences on teams, like, for example, preferred working style, were sort of lost, or an individual's desire for career advancement. Right? If you're only measuring the team output and you're only looking at what the team does, and there's an individual on the team who's working extremely hard, maybe taking classes at night, trying to improve their skills, is, you know, taking on harder and harder work and doing a better and better job. And yet the only thing that's ever measured is the team output and the team velocity. That individual feels like they're not really getting any credit. And if the organization doesn't have a way to recognize that person for their contribution and give them either promotion or compensation or something, then the person's just going to feel like they're not really appreciated, and they're going to leave and go somewhere else where they feel like they are appreciated and their skills are valued more highly. So it's really important to pay attention to individuals and to pay attention to teams. Both are really important. Now, with business understanding and technical understanding, here we're getting at the need for business leaders to pay a lot more attention to and understand what their tech teams are doing. And I don't mean they have to become engineers, right? And I don't mean that they have to, you know, like I took this DevOps class and I loved it and it was great. But I'm not suggesting that, you know, senior leader, business leaders take a class like that. But what I am saying though, is that they need to understand what their tech teams are doing and a little bit about how they're doing it, so that they have respect and trust with those teams, so that when their tech leaders come to them and tell them, you know, whatever the problem is, or there's some technical debt we absolutely have to tackle before we build that new feature, or we can't create that new product you really want us to create because it'll cause this other product our company has to break, or whatever it is, you know, the business leaders need to have enough understanding of what the tech people are talking about that they can have that conversation. And the technical folks also need to have business understanding. So, you know, engineers, sometimes I've seen this where they would prefer to just, you know, tell me what to do and tell me, you know, put all my requirements on the ticket and I'll just build the thing. And, you know, technical people, especially tech leads and senior engineers, need the full business picture. They need to understand what's going on in the company, what the context is, what the pain points are, where the revenue sources are, where the problems are, because that's going to inform all the decisions that they're making on a daily basis as they're building out their tech. And so both sides need to have more awareness of and understanding of each other's contexts and worldviews and perspectives in order to be successful. We talk a lot in the book about individual empowerment and good leadership, both. Self-organizing teams may be an ideal, right? But they're not easy to achieve. And they need to have the right combination of skill sets and seniority and experience. Typically, the people have to have been working together for a while, so they know each other pretty well. There's just a whole lot of things that go into a really successful self-organized team that can enable it to, you know, jump into becoming a high-performing team, and automatically giving every team autonomy and saying, you're self-organizing, so we're not going to give you a tech lead. We're not going to, you know, assign any kind of leadership. You're just going to have to figure it out because you're a self-organizing team. We feel like that's sort of like a misunderstanding of the concept, because if you go back to the original manifesto, that's not what they said. They said the best architectures, designs, and requirements come from self-organizing teams. They did not say all teams must be self-organizing, right? So, you know, I think sometimes what happens is it's not so much that the original Agile Manifesto has problems, although there are some things that were missing from it. But again, it was, you know, like 20 years ago, so that's okay. It's more the way the Agile community has misunderstood and misinterpreted some of these elements. And then that has created problems, because when teams are given too much autonomy, or they're trying to be self-organizing, they can kind of run into real trouble because they don't have proper leadership. They don't have the support that they need in order to be successful. And then the last one is adaptability and planning. And that really speaks to the need for both, right? I think it was Eisenhower who famously said, plans are useless, planning is everything. And I really understand that concept, because in the process of planning, you think through a lot of eventualities, and you come up with, well, if this happens, we'll do this. And if that happens, we'll do that. And you kind of think things through. And then you're in the moment and things change. And so you have to be adaptable. You have to throw away your plans sometimes and go with something different. But that doesn't mean that the planning itself was a waste of time. And there are many circumstances where planning is essential, because, for example, for tonight's talk, right? I didn't want to just show up here and wing it. right? I did a lot of planning and a lot of thought so that you would have a good experience and I could share something valuable with you. You may or may not like it, that's okay. But the point is that when you're in certain circumstances, planning is really appropriate and necessary. And so that has to be in balance with adaptability. Just because you did a lot of planning doesn't mean you need to stick to your plan. You need to be able to just adjust your plan in the moment when things change. So before I move forward, I'm curious if anybody has any questions.
Hi, Lisa. Good evening. Can you reflect more on the autonomy and decision making when the teams goes into self-organization mode? How can we help, even though when the team call themselves self-organized? How can we step in and help them?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the circumstances, and you'll hear me say that a lot, because that's kind of a core tenet of Agile 2, is that you need to look at the exact circumstances, and there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. But sometimes when self-organizing teams are struggling, we think, in the Agile world anyway, in the Agile community, we think that they're struggling because they don't know how to be self-organized, when maybe they're struggling because they don't have any leadership, right? They don't have a tech lead. They don't have anybody to make decisions. And say, especially if it's a group of like junior and mid-level people who don't have enough experience to make those decisions, they end up spending, I mean, I've seen this happen, weeks trying to decide something straightforward that a tech lead could probably take a look at some things and decide in a half a day or less, or an hour, And so sometimes we'll say to teams, you need to be more self-organizing. Well, what does that mean? I mean, if they don't have the right leadership, if they don't have a designer on their team, if their focus is, involves a lot of data and they don't have access to a data leader, either on their team or off their team, who can help them and support them, they're not going to be able to be successful. So I think what happens in the context of self-organizing teams is that we think that either the people themselves on the team are doing something wrong, or the scrum master or the coach is doing something wrong because they're not helping them become self-organizing. When really what we're looking at, if we step back and look in the bigger picture, is we're looking at an absence of healthy leadership. And so identifying what that team might need. Maybe they need a strong product manager. I mean, I don't know. It's going to be different for every team, right? Maybe they're engaged in multiple small projects on the side, and they can't handle them all in addition to their normal work. And so they need an organizer type person who can manage those projects and make sure that they get done on time, and then keep the rest of the work flowing so that the team doesn't slow down. There's all different types and kinds of leadership. So I think it's a question of identifying, and it might be somebody on the team, by the way. It doesn't necessarily have to be positional authority. It depends on the circumstances, but there might be an individual on the team who naturally is super organized and likes to, pay attention to dates and make sure things are done on time. And so that person can have some organizational leadership on the team. A lot of times it's a good idea to have a tech lead or someone who can make a decision when the team is spinning and can't choose and is going off in lots of different directions and wasting too much time debating. There's this concept of disagree and commit can be very, very powerful. Sometimes it's more important to move forward and get things done than it is to get consensus. And there's a misunderstanding that, a self-organizing team means that everybody talks about everything all the time, and every decision needs to be made by consensus. And, every decision, no matter how tiny, needs to be discussed by the entire team and decided as a group. And that can be, it feels good. It feels like everybody's participating and you feel that sense of connection to the people around you, but it can really slow you down. And it can actually, keep you from achieving your goals. And so you might have achieved the goal of consensus decision-making and self-organization, but you haven't achieved your goal of delivering working software. And so you lose your job or some other terrible thing happens, right? So, our goal isn't to be agile. Our goal isn't to be self-organizing. Our goal is to get stuff done and help the business succeed and make money for the organization. Or if it's not, I've worked for many years supporting the federal government. So they don't talk so much about business outcomes, but we do talk about the benefits. What are the benefits to society? Because I was working at the Department of Homeland Security. So, you're thinking about, well, what's the benefit to people if you're working at the TSA, for example, or the Coast Guard, right? So we don't talk so much about earning money, but we do talk about what a difference it's going to make to people. And it doesn't matter if you're agile, if you don't achieve your goal of delivering a benefit to the people you're sworn to protect. So the way that you define success is really important, but you need to have that, I'm sorry, I'm spacing out a little bit because I'm tired. It's late here on the East Coast. I apologize. I started thinking about DHS. I had such an interesting experience there, and some of my friends still work there. So it's a crazy time right now in the cybersecurity world, and started thinking about all those things. But anyway, let's move on to the, unless anybody has another question.
Yeah. Thank you. Awesome, Lisa. Thank you.
I'm looking to see if anybody's waving their hand or anything. Okay. Okay.
Lisa,
so, go ahead.
It's not more of a question. It's just a comment based on the individuals and teams part.
Mm-hmm.
That one's really, it seems that it can be very tricky because, again, you're teetering on trying to get acknowledgement from the team. So a lot of organizations are changing their review process to work more towards a team review, but still, have that input from the individual or make sure that they're getting acknowledgement where needed. So I find it, we don't have to go into a discussion with it, but I just find that interesting that in some of the examples, or an example that you use, but if there's more of them in terms of, like 360 reviews and different ways of actually bringing out someone that it doesn't overshadow the team, but it also complements that person. So I don't know.
Well, it's really a question of balance, right? I mean, a team is great, but a team is made up of individual human beings, and each one has different goals, desires, growth needs, and potential aspirations. We all probably have seen situations where a senior engineer was offered a management role, and they said, you know what, I kind of like being a senior engineer, and that's what I just want to do, and I don't really want to manage other people. So there's this it's really important to talk to people, really, just to get to know them. Like, there needs to be someone, whether it's the tech lead or an external manager for the team or whoever it is, an engineering manager. It depends on how your organization is structured, but someone who actually talks to people one-on-one. And, I completely, understand the desire to reward teams. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because you're going to promote teamwork and, promote more productivity from that team. And at the same time, to pay attention to the individuals and their needs and working style and what they need in order to be the most productive and the most valuable for the team. And so I think it's a question here again of balance. Like, we're not really prescriptive about how to do this in our materials or in the book, because it depends on the case, the individual case, I think, or the company. But I think when you ignore individuals and you don't pay attention to that human side of relationships, that's when things can start to break down, because we're just people. We're the same. And humans all need to be respected and to have their, career path and growth and development nurtured and supported by the people in the organization where we work. And if they don't provide that, we'll just go work somewhere else, because the truth is, in the tech industry, everybody has options, right? I mean,
yeah, agree. Yeah.
Yeah, they just, you know, they don't need to stay where they are. And so if you can provide that growth opportunity and career trajectory for folks, they're, you know, more likely to, because they're continuing to grow. And I think as individual humans, you know, probably you're all here because you're curious. You're like, what is this? I've never heard of this before. You want to learn. You want to learn something new. And you're taking your own time out of your day at the end of a long day. And you've probably been on Zoom calls all day, or many of us have. I don't know. So I hear San Francisco's opening up more, but the point is, you know, you're seeking knowledge, right? And that's because it's just such an intense human drive, especially for people who are in the knowledge work field and who are very creative and curious by nature. And so we need to nurture that element in the people that work on teams, the individuals. Let's see, somebody offered a sports team. Yes. Ongoing tension is a good description. Ongoing tension, balance. I often, you know, feel like, you know, it's walking a tight wire. You know, you don't want to go too far one way or the other. One of the things that Cliff talks about a lot in his talk is that the idea of extremes, and how, you know, we had extreme programming in the 90s, and sometimes when people interpret things and go to one extreme, it's just too far and it just doesn't work. So like the example I gave earlier about self-organizing teams, it's like, well, you look at the Agile Manifesto, it's not that extreme. It's not that really radical of a statement. But if you morph it into something extreme, which is all teams should be self-organizing, now that's extreme, right? And that's what doesn't work. And so we talk a lot in the book and in our materials about how having a balance is what's really important. And it's not that extremes, when they happen from time to time, are wrong or bad. It's just that when we always try to go towards a particular extreme, we're going to run into trouble, because the world is just too complex and it's just probably not going to work. All right, so there are a lot of principles, so I'm not going to talk about all of them. We group them into categories in order to identify, you know, sort of make it easier to absorb. So, and they're not necessarily in priority order either. So the first category is planning, transition, and transformation. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions now, and you don't need to answer them. They're just for you to think about. So how many of you have been part of an Agile transformation? Once, twice, more than that? How long did it take, and was it successful?
Still in process.
And why do you think that was?
In theory, everybody's on board. In practice, they struggle depending on their role, or just really being able to take the time to grasp what it is they agreed to be doing.
I mean, those of us working in this area know that this is really hard. And just because we have been working in this area for a while and we know what we're doing doesn't mean we can just walk in and wave our magic wand and make it so, right? And I'd like to highlight here the second one, 1.2, any significant transformation is mostly a learning journey, not merely a process change. And I think you've probably heard similar ideas, but what we try to emphasize is that it's a journey without a destination. So you don't really ever quite arrive. You get a little bit better over time, and then you get a little bit better, and you might take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and then 1 step forward. And you know, it's a really pretty complex yeah, it's not a transformation, it's a journey, and it's a learning journey, because essentially it's about people and how they feel and what they think and what they do. And it's about the culture of the organization and the way that the organization's culture decides or tries to learn and grow, as well as, you know, the individual humans within that organization, how they learn and grow. And what I've seen is, you know, many organizations treat transformation as a process. Like, we're going to hire you as a consulting company or whoever it is, they, you know, individuals to come in, and then we want you to go work with those people down there and make them agile. And then just come back and tell us when we can get our software more quickly. You know, they think of it as like a process, and it's something you just do at one stage, you know, like everybody talks about water, scrum, fall. It's this idea that, you know, everything before the development team gets their requirements is waterfall. And then they can be agile within that tiny little space of building software. But then afterwards, you know, it's not really that agile. And transformation, as we all know, is about the whole system, right? It's systemic, and it looks across all of, not just the tech organization, but the entire organization. And so it really affects the culture of the organization. And that's why, you know, we emphasize, as I'm sure many of you do, running small experiments, because through those small experiments, you learn and grow. And hopefully the experiments are small enough that they're not colossally expensive mistakes for the organization when things don't go well, and create an atmosphere where we learn from our experiments, even if they fail, and we don't blame individuals and we don't blame teams. And we just keep trying to learn and grow and view the entire thing as a learning journey. This category is for the principles that are related to product portfolio and stakeholders. The first one is probably the most important, especially for anybody who's involved with product development and product discovery. And, you know, when I first started learning about Agile years ago, this seemed so obvious to me that you would have to do this, that it didn't really occur to me that people didn't do it. But then the more I learned about how organizations actually work, the more I realized that getting tight feedback loops sounds intuitive and is not that easy to achieve necessarily if there's organizational resistance. You know, Peter Drucker, I think it was Peter Drucker, used to talk about an organization having an immune system. So like the organization will push back on change that it doesn't want. And so if the organization is not in the habit of talking to their customers and letting engineers speak directly to users and customers and get information from them, then, you know, when you suggest it, it seems like just a complete shock, right? Like they're just like, well, I don't talk to customers, I write code. And it's like, well, you know, and I'm not talking about on the individual level, but also in the team level, like everyone collectively is sort of like surprised by this idea. What, like actually talk to our users? It's like, yeah, just talk to them. Go watch them use the product, see what they say, you know, figure out how they interact with what you're building. And then the other one that's really important that we emphasize a lot is 2.4. Product design must be integrated with product implementation. There wasn't a lot of talk of design in the original Agile manifesto, and we, the Agile 2 team really feels that design is central to everything, and good design is really essential. I work at the news media company Axios, and at Axios, design is highly valued and has pride of place in everything that gets built. And I've really come to admire and respect the design team and the organization for valuing high quality design as a way to build our brand, but also to provide users with a really high quality user experience, because it goes beyond just beauty, right? Or smoothness of operations or something like that. It's also just the whole user experience and connecting the way that things feel emotionally and the beauty of them and the design to the product. And I think that that's really important. And sometimes when in Agile process, right, we're talking about Scrum, we don't really talk about design. When we're talking about Kanban, we're not really talking about design. Like, how does that fit in? I mean, we don't give it enough attention. And so we think that product design needs to be integrated at every step of the way, from the very, very beginning all the way through getting user feedback and deciding how to respond to it. There's very little said in the original manifesto, or I don't think there's anything said about data really. But now data is sort of everything, and it's so incredibly important. And we need to secure the data. We have to be able to mine the data. We have to have production-like data in our testing environments so that we can make sure that we're testing, it's no good having great environments if you don't have realistic production-like data that you can test against. We need to have understanding of the data models. We need to collect business data and have really good dashboards and ways of communicating back to the stakeholders, whatever data it is that they need, and ideally give them tools to be able to find and analyze the data themselves so that they can get information they need in real time, and even ideally build their own dashboards. And in a lot of organizations, this is kind of ad hoc or thought about later after they've already built out a product, and then they start realizing that they've got to deal with data. But we really think that it needs to be something you think about at the beginning, and that you really focus on the strategic value of data and your obligation to your company and your users about securing the data and so on. I'm curious, does anybody here work in data areas or with data teams? No?
Yes, I did, Lisa.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. So yeah, the challenge always I faced is getting the business data and at the same time securing the business data, especially when the personal information is involved. So
yep.
Yeah, that's been a challenge.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed working with the data team at my company and helping them create really strong and healthy agile approaches to what they're doing that also are modified to make space for, because we have one team that has data scientists, data analysts, and data engineers together on one team, and they're just terrific. They needed, we had a lot of conversations around what type of work are they doing and how do we modify Scrum, Kanban, all the different things. What does it mean to do product discovery if you're a data team, and how do you do validation and so forth? It's been really a journey for me, and learning a lot about how important data is and how essential it is to, if you can, to think about it early and build that into whatever you're doing, and have it not be something you think about later, because it's much harder to get a handle on it if you wait.
Agreed.
Now, this really is what I've been talking about this whole evening, which is this idea of it all depends on your context, and everything needs to be adjusted based on the circumstances that you're dealing with. So our feeling about frameworks, is that you need to fit the framework to your organization. People said, a lot of people in the Agile community say negative things I've heard about SAFe. And I don't like to I like to judge for myself. I like to find out about things and make up my own mind about stuff. So I went and took a SAFE class, and I found a lot to like in that class. And I liked that they said, you know, that you really need to tailor SAFE for your organization. You know, you don't, they even said, you know, don't just take this and do it exactly by the book. I mean, you need to think about what type of organization do you have? What do you need? What do you, you know, and all that, and tailor it. And the other thing they said was identify champions at the executive level early on and make sure that they understand what it is you're undertaking and are on board with you and can support you. I personally think that, you know, all that old saying, right? All models are wrong and some models are useful. And my feeling is, my only philosophy is whatever works. So I don't think that frameworks in and of themselves are good or bad or right or wrong. They just need to be applied in different circumstances. Like when I first got to Axios and people were talking about SAFE, I was like, well, that's nuts. You only have 30 people. You don't need that, right? So, you know, it's SAFE was created to support very, very large organizations that are trying to do an agile transformation with a lot of people. So, you know, everything needs to be suited for the situation at hand. And another thing is about frameworks and methodologies is that they sort of promote this concept of best practice. And I really kind of cringe when I hear that phrase best practice, because, you know, I've moved around in my current organization, moved around and supported several different teams. And each time I get to a new team, they say, well, tell us the best practices and tell us what you did with the last team. And it's like, well, yeah, but you're a different team. You do different kind of work and you have different needs and you have a different group of people. And they say, well, just tell us the best practices. And it's like, well, what is the best practice? I don't know. You know, they'll ask me questions like, what's better, Scrum or Kanban? And it's like, well, I'm sure some of you have been in that situation. So really, I think frameworks are patterns, right? They're constructs that have worked well for people in the past. Somebody or another tried them out as an experiment and it really worked. And it may have worked because it was a great framework. It may have worked because of the unique context that they were in. And it's worth learning about those things and trying them out as experiments in your own organization. But when you think that a framework can give you like a checklist or a recipe for success, that's when you start to run into trouble, because none of them are really complete, right? They're all kind of missing some things. Like product discovery isn't really a part of the Scrum framework, but it's really important. And so I think that the real problem is not the frameworks themselves, it's using them as scripture, right? And asking teams to do things just because it's in the framework that aren't really useful for them, right? And this idea that, you know, Scrum isn't Scrum unless you do it exactly perfectly the way it's in the Scrum guide. I think that's also not necessarily useful, because there could be circumstances where you just need to make some adjustments, and it doesn't mean it's not Scrum and it doesn't mean it's bad, right? So I think it's not, and there's nothing wrong with Scrum, right? I use Scrum for a lot of things. So I'm not saying Scrum is bad or anything like that, but I just think treating it as scripture, treating it as immutable is where we start to really get into trouble. Several of the people in our group are engineers, and we talked a lot about the importance of technical excellence. And, you know, almost every organization today is a tech company. My husband works for a law firm, and I've had conversations with him where I've tried to say, you know, you have a tech operation in your law firm. You just don't necessarily think of, you're not a software company, of course, but, you know, almost every modern type of business has so much tech and software involved, whether they purchase something or they create custom software for something they need, or building a website or whatever they're doing. So it just becomes integral to their success as a business, and it needs to be built into their, you know, corporate strategy. And, you know, platform and architecture decisions can either enable future business capabilities or restrict them. those decisions are vital to the long-term existence and success of the company. And so business agility and technical agility need to go hand in hand. This is a hard sell sometimes because in our society, we're so specialized, you know, people study for years and get to be an expert and get to be really good at a certain area. And business leaders don't really want to take the time to understand their products and services and how they're built. They feel that they, you know, other people can take care of that. And sometimes tech people don't want to understand the business and take the time to really study and understand the strategy and what's going on with the revenue and how does revenue tie into what we're trying to accomplish and how are these business outcomes going to help us be successful. So there needs to be, this was a really clear thing that came up in these conversations with the 15 people who developed the Agile 2 philosophy, is that there really needs to be more conversation and collaboration between those two. And it's really hard because those two both feel like they don't really need to take the time to do that, that they can, you know, that can be somewhat siloed. But the big companies that are really successful, like Amazon and Tesla and companies like that, there's almost no separation between the business and the tech. It's like, it's all part of the same system, and people need to be aware of both so that they can optimize the business outcomes while they're optimizing the tech outcomes. Now, this is where we got in a little bit to this idea of individuality. Pardon me, I'm so sorry. Versus the team. People are different. I mean, you know, just think of you and your friends, your coworkers, I mean, and your family, you know, everybody's so different. We don't learn the same way. We don't think the same way. We don't have the same opinions. And when we treat people like they're all the same, we can run into trouble. So, you know, some people really love team rooms and sitting all together, but some people are just not really comfortable with that and really don't do their best work in that environment. They need their own space. They need privacy. They need quiet. They need time to focus, time to think. I mean, I think this is something the pandemic has really taught all of us, is that, you know, you may have thought that everyone had to go into the office and sit together in the same room and work together in order to be productive. And when that became impossible, people found other ways to work together and discovered that they could still be really productive anyway, even though they were working remotely. So I think what we need to do with teams is we need to respect the individuals within the team and still find ways for the team to be successful. So when we create team norms, we don't want to just vote and impose the will of the majority on the minority. We need to really think about what does each individual person on that team really need to be successful, and how can we create an environment for them to be the most successful that they can be. We also might want to think about communication styles, right? So individuals like have different ways that they like to communicate with each other and different ways that they will respond better to one another. And so having intentional conversations, I had a wonderful conversation with the team that was just real frustrated dealing with the sort of, they've had email and Slack and GitHub and Jira comments on tickets, and they were just losing their ability to really communicate coherently. And they said to me, you know, Lisa, what should we do? Should we just always use Jira? And I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't care if you use Jira or email. The point is, does everybody agree? And are these, what are the communication channels that are going to work for this particular group? And what's going to work for individuals, right? Like, so if somebody has a technical impediment or some kind of disability of some kind, or some some impairment that prevents them from using a particular tool. I mean, just have those conversations and just figure that out, because the important thing is that you have good communication with each other. No, it doesn't have to always be face-to-face. No, you don't, in my opinion, you do not always have to have your video on. It is fine for you to turn your video off if you want to. I think that, the emphasis on face-to-face communication that we saw in again, from the Agile Manifesto is, it's a statement of what's really important about how to make sure that you don't have misunderstandings. But sometimes face-to-face communication isn't possible. And as we all know from the last year of the pandemic, there's a big difference between sitting with somebody live in a room and sitting and being on a Zoom screen. Like when you're on a Zoom screen, you're sort of under a microscope, right? And you're very conscious of things, and you can see yourself often you can see yourself, and it's just a very different kind of experience. And for introverts, it can be excruciatingly painful. And they just might really not like it, and they just don't feel comfortable with it. And so telling them that they have to do it a certain way is really not healthy for that person, and is probably not going to be healthy for that person's interaction with the team, because they're not going to be able to be as productive as they might otherwise if they were allowed to work in a way that they felt comfortable with and that worked for them. So really what we're trying to say here is not that the individual is more important than the team or anything like that, but just that you need to always consider the human being, right? You always have to think about, how do we respect and honor the people who are generating unbelievable products for the benefit of the organization? That the people are really the most important part of this whole thing. And people are so sensitive, they get their feelings hurt, right? Just like you, they get upset about stuff, and some are better than others at regulating their emotions and deciding when and how to share them. And they make mistakes, and they're not perfect. And so honoring that and allowing people to be very different than one another, and not forcing them all to interact in the exact same way we spent a lot of time talking about that, and about how to encourage all different types of people within a group to emerge and be successful with each other. I feel like I've been talking too much. I mean, I have 3 more sections to go here, but I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions or observations they'd like to share.
Lisa, I'll share something. So you were talking quite a bit about the balance, as well as, each organization and each group is different and unique. That's how I have operated, but I have come across in organizations that there are a lot of purists, whether they're agile purists or whether they're Kanban purists, whatever you want to call them, right? And that's, I find these people to be the most difficult in terms of changing, even though they call themselves purists, but their mindset is the most difficult to move them into an agile mindset. That's what I have found personally.
And they're purist about?
They're more purist about, I guess, the methodology than being the agile mindset. That's what I've seen. So it's about, hey, we got to have 7 people in a team, not 10 or 11, as an example.
Okay. Yeah, I think, it's funny. I've done a lot of talks on cognitive bias. I'm really interested in cognitive science and how our brains work and how we think. And one of the enduring lessons I learned from all of my research on that is that just because I know a lot about them, I still have them. Every day I exhibit them because it's an automatic way that our brains work. And I think the best we can do is realize when we're subject to something that's clouding our thinking and preventing us from making good decisions or seeing clearly, and trying to get a better perspective on what's happening. And when someone is convinced that something is true and real, they believe that so strongly that even when they're faced with evidence to the contrary, they'll still cling to their belief. Belief is incredibly powerful. Belief is more powerful than evidence, generally. Our brains are really strong because we evolved to, live on the plains of Africa and survive all of the hardships. And we evolved ways of thinking that helped us survive in that environment. And they're incredibly strong. And we can't even necessarily, it's difficult to even achieve awareness of that. And so, for example, saying working software over comprehensive documentation. Well, you can go back and study the original Agile Manifesto the way we did and talk about, well, they're not saying there's no value in documentation. They're actually saying there is value in comprehensive documentation. We just value working software more, right? But you can have that, okay, so we can philosophically, we can go look at that. But if somebody has convinced themselves because of exposure to the Agile community, because of something they learned somewhere, some class they took, or they learned Scrum on the job and they think they know it really well. And they maybe have never read the Agile Manifesto, right? And they just think we don't need to document. We just don't need to document things because we're Agile and we don't have to do documentation in Agile, right? And so what the person is clinging to, their belief that they're clinging to, is actually not even something that the original creators of the whole thing would have supported, and may not even be aligned with Scrum or Kanban or whatever system they're using. But it's their belief. And so therefore, they feel very strongly about it.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I definitely feel that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're going much deeper than what I've thought about. So thank you, Lisa, for that.
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations around this whole concept of how do you reach people's deepest core beliefs. And we decided intentionally to create a new set of values and principles, because ultimately at the end of the day, we thought maybe at the beginning that we were going to, have a new framework or a new model or a new, I don't know. We didn't know when we started out, because it took 8 months, by the way, of going back and forth on all this. So we weren't sure where we were going to end up. But as we worked on it, it really became clear that what we were talking about was just core principles. Mm-hmm. And that was the way to sort of start to talk about these things. Because, if we don't fix this, when I say we, let me back up. If the Agile community doesn't address the challenges that I've been describing and that Cliff has been describing and that this group of us talked about for 8 months, and probably almost all of you have examples of, if we don't address this, then something else is going to replace Agile. I don't know what it will be. It might be DevOps. It might be something else. It might be somebody will name it something different. Because, what we're doing right now isn't really working. But at the same time, I fell in love with Agile. I love Agile. I think it's great. I wanted to be involved in this effort, not because I thought there was anything bad or wrong with Agile. It was because I wanted to make sure that it stays vibrant, stays relevant, continues to help and support organizations and help them grow and help them, get better business outcomes, and help individuals within those organizations to be happier and more connected, and all of those things that we care about, right? I would hate to see it just go away and be replaced by a set of technical practices only. Not that DevOps is that, because I think DevOps does pay a lot of attention to culture, but I think we can go deeper with culture. And I think what we need to do is really think about the future, like what what are we going to be talking about in 20 years when we're talking about how to manage software? Are we going to be talking about agile software development or something else? I don't know. Where are we going? And this is our attempt to articulate what we think is really important and what we think people need to really think about when they're trying to figure out how to be successful and to continue to be relevant in the Agile space. So we're not trying to, throw away the original Agile. I mean, it's great. And I kind of, in a way, it's like I'm trying to save Agile from itself. I'm trying to improve it or make sure it the best aspects of what we've all been trying to do are retained. And we try to articulate that clearly in this set of values and principles, intentionally not making it a framework because we don't think that having something that step by step necessarily really works.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for that. The other question or comment I will make, which probably is going to spur quite a bit of, discussion and thoughts as well, is about metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I touch that, it's a hot potato item because everybody wants metrics, but they want all different kinds of metrics as well.
They want all kinds of, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I think we have somebody sharing. Okay, thank you. No, I mean, it's like, they try to, everybody wants so many different metrics that it becomes unmanageable,
right.
Number one. Number two, they don't know how to use the metrics as well, because, many of them, they may be the same thing. For example, velocity, story points. It doesn't make sense. I keep telling people, it doesn't make sense to compare story velocity from one team to another, but they still keep asking for it as an example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a constant struggle that I go through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you. And I worked at the Department of Homeland Security. It was like metrics about everything. Metrics about things that just, it felt like they didn't really matter. But we had all the numbers for them. And I think sometimes what we can fall into is the trap of measuring something because it's easy to measure versus measuring it because it tells us information that really makes a difference into anything that we're doing. So I don't really have, we didn't talk a lot as a group in Agile 2 about metrics and measurements. So I don't really have a lot to offer from an Agile 2 perspective about that. I do think that when we talk about being data-driven and we want to rely only on metrics, then we have to be really careful about what numbers we have. Outcomes versus outputs. Yeah, exactly. Well, we used to teach a class at DHS when I was there for a while in the program management area. This is departing a little bit from the Agile 2 topic, but a class on metrics and measurements. And I had the opportunity then to work with some incredible subject matter experts on those topics. And exactly, this comment about outcomes versus outputs. It's really hard sometimes to measure outcomes, especially if you're the government and your outcome is, that nothing happened, right? You were trying to prevent an attack or prevent a calamity or prevent a problem. How do you measure that, right? So you measure outputs instead because that's something that you can measure. And you have to make sure that the outputs that you're measuring are actually have some bearing on the outcomes, right? And so you don't accidentally measure outputs that aren't important and that don't really have any bearing on the outcomes. And so I don't really know what to suggest to you. I know some teams have given up using story points at all and just use t-shirt sizing. I have never seen any place anywhere start using story points and not somehow do things like say, for example, every team needs to accomplish 10 story points per person on the team, or this team is doing better than that team because they accomplished 89 story points less sprint, and this other team only accomplished 34 story points. I just, as soon as you start putting numbers that specific, people just automatically start making comparisons like that are nonsense and don't have any meaning.
Lisa, I'm just going to add to that is that I think comes back to your original comments or thoughts about, we might be missing the point here, or in terms of what's important to you as a business and the organization. Are we focusing on delivering value to the customer, or are we focusing on the metrics that delivers the work that we're delivering? And a lot of that times, and to Gopal's point, is that we get so lost in the work that we're doing that all of a sudden and I'm not speaking for everyone, I don't mean to, and I've just seen this too, is that we stop having those conversations about what is the outcome, what is the value that we're delivering to the customer itself, and so we get kind of locked in that discussion. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm departing a little bit from the core Agile 2 ideas here, but I will say that I find that an organization's compensation and reward system is related to this, because very often individuals or teams are rewarded for outputs and not necessarily rewarded or recognized for outcomes. It's often really hard to tie outcomes to a particular individual or a team. It's hard to take credit for something going well. But when a person's promotion potential and compensation is related to output, then they will have more output, right? There is no system of metrics that can't be gamed. And at one point, when I was working with a team of Agile coaches at DHS, where we were working with like thousands of engineers and a large agency, we used to talk about how let's take the fact that people will game the metrics and use it to our advantage and create metrics whereby if they game them, they'll be doing the things we want them to do. So it was like a double, mind game thing going on there. It didn't really work very well though, because people are too smart. But my point is that anytime you have any kind of incentive system that's tied to output, then human nature is that people, it doesn't matter if they're just an ordinary person working on a team or if they're a very high level executive whose compensation and rewards are tied to outputs. If that's what the organization is measuring and incentivizing, then that's what people will deliver. So it's a tough problem. It's a really tough problem. And I think, this gets to a little bit of what we are talking about here with this category of principles of focus, which is how important it is to really focus and have intentional conversations or exchanges, possibly over time, like maybe in writing even, when you're, trying to explore something really deep. And I went to a wonderful talk by Linda Rising at Agile 2019, where she was explaining a brainstorming technique. And I actually took that back with me and used it, and it worked really well, where you brainstorm over a period of a week instead of trying to get everybody together in a room and say, okay, everybody, 1, 2, 3, go, have your best ideas right now, which is really hard. People just typically don't think that way, right? And instead, it was a very thoughtful process of putting some ideas out there, letting people sleep on it. They have conversations, they discuss it, they come back, contribute some more ideas, go home and sleep on it some more, come up with a few more things, and just sort of really take advantage of the way our brains work, the way that, you know, at night we actually do, in fact, create new neural pathways and come up with new ideas. And I'm sure all of you have had that experience of trying to solve some very difficult problem, or even if it was just balance your checkbook, whatever it was the night before, and you go to sleep and you get up the next day and it's, for some reason you can do it. It's easy. And so, you know, really complex ideas require deep exchanges over time, and you might need multiple sessions to really get through a complex issue. And so we really value that and feel that it's really important to foster deep exchanges between people in an organization so that you can, essentially what we're trying to do here is maximize people's brains, right? All of us work we're all knowledge workers, right? And we're paid because we can think well, and we're creative, and we're productive, and we do all these, you know, we have all these cool capabilities, whether it's building software or managing teams or making strategic decisions. It's essentially creative thinking. And so we need to respect the way our brains work and nurture our brains and nurture that thought process and strive to find ways to bring our best thoughts to our work and to each other so that we can be successful. All right, last one. I've sort of touched on a lot of these. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but we do emphasize leadership considerably. We feel that it's incredibly important and cannot be overemphasized how important it is to have good leadership. Bad leadership will, you know, usually ruin most organizations. But the best agile processes in the world and, you know, an agile mindset among teams isn't really going to go anywhere if you have leadership that is going in a different direction and is not on board and is undermining and working against the agility that you're trying to bring to the organization. So you need to have all different kinds of leadership, right? There's all the different, well, there's styles, right? There's servant leadership, Socratic leadership. You know, there's different approaches and styles that work. And then there's different roles like product leadership, design leadership, people to focus on workflow, whatever it is, right? You need to have all of these things in place in order to be successful. And I think leadership was not enough of an emphasis in the Agile community. And it might partly be because of this idea that everything should be self-organizing. And that kind of implies, it doesn't come right out and say, but it implies that you don't really need leaders. But I think actually you really do need leaders. You just need the right type of leader, the right kind of leadership at the right time in the right place. So I'm not talking here about authoritarian micromanagement or anything like that. I'm talking more about like a visionary. You might need a visionary leader, somebody who can inspire and motivate the team, help them understand what they're doing and why it's important and how it fits in. So we do talk a lot about leadership in the book. And I think my biggest challenge personally, I'll be honest with you, is that I'm usually not in a position of authority where I can do much about the leadership. And that's where it gets really frustrating, because it's like, yeah, I know this is really important, but what am I supposed to do about it? And so that's where I think as coaches, we can, we may not be able to actually hire people and put them, or maybe some of you can, and if you can, that's terrific. But if you're not in that role, you can at least say to the people that you're working with that you think that a particular team maybe needs a team lead, or they need a tech lead, or they need a really strong product manager, or maybe they don't even need leadership in the sense of having someone on the team who's a leader, but they might need access and exposure to someone who is a really inspiring and motivational leader to come in and communicate with the team directly and help them understand the big picture and inspire them to, you know, go in the right direction. So, you know, you can at least try to bring that element in as best you can. I'm curious if anyone here has had this kind of experience where you felt like leadership was needed but wasn't available for the teams that you were supporting.
Lisa, I have a nuanced thought to that. I feel, there are different types of leadership as we, as you mentioned, right? But the personality of the leader determines the culture of the group or organization. And it's important to take that into account. It's not just the leadership style, as they say that in the books. It's the personality that matters quite a bit as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what I would like to add to this leadership, piece that you have.
Yeah. Well, I've seen a lot of different types of personalities be successful leaders. The people, the good leaders that I've worked with in my career have not all, in other words, they haven't all had the same personality. So I think that different types of personalities can still become good leaders. I've also seen individuals learn leadership. Like, we tend to think of it and assume it's sort of born, like people are born leaders and they either have it or they don't. But I don't agree with that. I think people can learn leadership skills and learn to become better leaders and lead in their own way that is in alignment. And as far as personalities, I mean, I think that's where somebody else mentioned 360 reviews. I think when individuals, it's not like you need to change your personality or anything, but you do need to be aware of the impact that your personality has on other people, because that impact is going to either drive the people who you lead to success, or hold them back and put roadblocks in their way, right? So it's not like you have to change your personality, but you do need to be aware of the impact your personality has at a human level on the people around you, and become self-aware, so that then you can become intentional about the style of leadership that you're going to choose for the given situation.
Lisa, I would call out 10.6. The team often needs more than one leader. It the Agile, as I teach it, says that everyone on the team needs to be a leader, and that, I mean, it's basically what Google found in the Aristotle study, was that equality and conversational turn taking, which suggests that every single person, there's no one silent. Everyone leads, and it's not like there's two leaders at any one time. It's that the leadership passes transparently among everyone on the team, and there are as many leaders as there are members of the team, including the intern.
I think that works really well as long as everyone on the team is fully cognizant of the layers of seniority and expertise and knowledge that each person brings. So, like, you want to listen to and respect and honor the intern's perspective and thoughts, but you may not want the intern to choose your architectural strategy. Right?
Nor the architect to do the product management, nor the product manager to do the architecture.
Or the engineer to do the design, right? I mean, so it works when, and also there could be a situation where you have a brand new junior engineer and a very senior person, and they're trying to decide what tool to use. And the junior person, essentially says, I want what I want. And the senior person says, they decide by vote and they get voted out. And it's like, well, maybe in that situation, it might've been better to listen to the person who's had 20 years of experience and used maybe 15 different tools of a similar nature, and who might be able to give some insight and support on how to make this decision. So I think what it depends on how much respect and knowledge there is among the team members of they need to know each other, basically, right? They need to understand and know each other and trust each other. And, you know, if I go to the doctor and the doctor tells me I need a certain type of medicine, I'm not going to argue and say, no, you know, I really need this other type of medicine. I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I came there because of their expertise, right? So as long as we have that kind of understanding and respect, it can work really well. I think when we misapply that as like everything has to be by consensus and every decision is made by majority vote and everyone's a leader, and you know, it feels good to be a leader, right? It feels good to make decisions and feel like you can control the behavior of other people because you're the leader and you decided. And so sometimes people will step forward. I mean, autonomy feels great. It's very, you know, it boosts our ego. And so, you know, we just have to do this mindfully, which I'm sure you do teach when you talk about this, because you don't tell people this means everybody's equal and you make every decision by a vote. No, not at all. Right? You want to create an environment where leadership can emerge wherever it needs to be.
I ask people to think through their careers and identify the best team they've ever been on.
Yeah.
And share the characteristics of that team. And the words trust, and you use the word trust and the word respect, those two words always come up, without exception.
Yeah, I've had that same experience whenever I've run that exercise. It's a trust and respect. Yeah. I think that we need to be very clear in our own minds and make important distinctions about how important those are and how that relates to the concept of self-organization and autonomy, and to find the right balance for an individual situation. So the team is, you know, they want to be equal and they try to make good decisions, but sometimes they may need, you know, if they're spinning or even making bad decisions, they might need a tech lead, you know, and that doesn't mean leadership can't emerge in other ways at other times, right? Like sometimes, like some of the teams I work with, they're experimenting with having feature leads. It's like individual engineers will say, this is, you know, my feature and I'm going to shepherd this feature and take care of all the things related to that feature. So, you know, you can find all kinds of ways for people to show their leadership for the team. I think the important thing is to create an environment that fosters the emergence of the leadership that needs to happen in the moment, because that can shift too, right? From week to week or month to month. It doesn't have to be a positional title.
So, hey, this is Jay. Hey, Lisa. So we got 15 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm just pointing that out to you so that, you know, we can, you know, have some Q&A time, but it seems like everyone's very interactive. One thing I would like your team to consider when I look at the validate the ideas through contained experiments, one of the things I suggest is to look at chaos engineering. So those things you were just talking about with Ron and everything about leadership and about changes and about adaptability. Well, Google's really good about this, where they disrupt teams and organizations, where they pull someone off or make changes happen, and it's monitored. It's a scientific experiment, and we see what can happen, what happens, right? So, for example, you know, a really good experiment every company could have done was, you know, what would happen if a pandemic occurred and you had to work at home, you know, and would have been prepared. But, you know, that's hindsight. But that's the notion of chaos engineering. It's more than just SRE and putting bugs in the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
so it's about organizational change, and it's about human beings and how we can deploy these experiments and then identify, you know, what happens and what we can learn from it, right? And you know, as you know, complexity science, you know, anytime we deal with human beings, one never knows what's going to happen. So the notion of having these experiments, you might, your team might want to look at complexity science and chaos engineering and maybe apply some of those techniques as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a good idea. So at Google, when they do this, do they just like tell people you have to switch teams? I mean, how do they actually do that?
So they have, it's a proctored type of thing. So they come up with the engineering science of what they're going to do and what the outcome they want. So they'll say, here's a really good example. Well, what would happen if we took the most productive software engineer off the team for 2 or 3 months? How would the team respond? What would happen? We don't know, right? So they do it.
But I mean, what if do they go to that person and say, does the person have a choice? Or do they just go to the person and say, you're off the team, that's it?
Yes, but they have a good reason. It's not like, oh, you know, where, you know, it is a ploy, and we try to be very careful. In a sense, it's an experiment. It's a blind experiment. So we try to control it in that way. So like, oh, we got to move you off because we have this important thing you got to do over here. We made a, you know, business decision. It's very proctored, right? And they move the person because we don't want to bias the experiment, right? So we have to figure out how to do these things without having bias in the experiment. So we figure out how to do that, right? And so for that example, we would figure out how to communicate it effectively so we don't create bias like what the hell's going on? Well, of course, people are going to say what the hell's going on, right? But we try to engineer it so that, oh yeah, we got to take this person, he's got to go off and do this or whatever. We have this special project that they have to do, right? And it's critical important because, hey, he's the best coder, right? And then we give the team stuff to do that we know they can't do with this person not there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what happens, right? And what we find is the team a lot of times does better. The outcome and how they work together and figure it out. It's the journey, like you said before, and how they've gelled together to figure it out has amazing results, right? And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they fail, right? So what we try to do is learn from that experiment, right? There's many experiments we do, and you have to be careful because sometimes they try to do experiments to see what would happen if something occurred that would hurt the brand, right? You try not to do those too often. But these are things we're trying to figure out today is what can we do to your point here, validate ideas to contain experiments, right? So when we try to look at how to validate ideas, it's like, oh, cool. Well, what are the big things that can happen, like a pandemic, right? So what kind of things can we implore into the experimentation of the organization and the culture to see how they would react to that and how we would plan for it? Now, most companies never did that. I'm just throwing that out there. So those are kind of things that I see more interest in complexity science and chaos engineering. And I see that in in a lot of what you talked about today. That would be an interesting thing to see how you can implement that. And they have to be careful, of course, to validate some of the disruptions that you could have. And then how would the team react to that? How would they recover? How would they do better? How would they survive?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be careful though. So, Lisa, do you have more to discuss, or is number 10 the last part of Agile 2?
Well, there is a lot more because I mean, there's 43 principles and we talked about some of them. But really this talk is intended to be an introduction to what we came up with, how we came up with it, why we wanted to do it in the first place. And an invitation to all of you to join in the conversation, to learn more, to engage with us on LinkedIn and share your ideas, your thoughts, your objections, we've had all kinds of different points of view. And, we're really just trying to further the field, I would say. We don't typically use that word in the Agile community to describe ourselves and what we're trying to do. But that's, for me personally, that's kind of, I think of it as my field. And I would like to contribute professionally to the advancement of the field. And this is our way of offering something that we think might be helpful, really.
Cool. And then this is published in a book, right? And they can reach out to you through your information and contact to learn more. Mm-hmm. And then reach out to you if they want to contribute or participate, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. So Lisa, do you want to open up for any more questions, or do you have?
If anyone has more questions, sure, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, so just open up your mic if you have a question and fire away. I could pick on people.
No, don't do that. No, it's okay. People are tired. I know. I myself, I go to a lot of meetups. I run a meetup. I speak at meetups, and it's at the end of a day. And
that's an agile anti-pattern, Jay.
Yeah, I know. But sometimes we got to force the envelope. So it's 10:52, Lisa. I think your time, correct?
Yes, it is.
Holy moly! Well, I don't. Since there's not any more questions, unless someone speaks up really quick, I want to give Lisa time to, go to bed and get up in the morning. And I want to thank her so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
And doing this, it's wonderful. I learned a lot, and I do want to learn more. So thank you so much. And
well,
again,
I hope.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. I was just going to say, I hope it's the start of a conversation.
Yes, that's exactly what I was about to say. This is the beginning of the conversation. Reach out to Lisa. I'll publish the Zoom recording and the presentation and put it out there for everyone and publicize it. So
thank you.
Again, thank you so much for Lisa. Thank you everyone for joining.
I just saw a question.
Oh, okay, cool.
From Michael, is there any specific application of some of Agile 2 that your group is tracking?
Oh,
yeah, that's a good question. Yes and no. Several, like one of us runs a software company in Australia, and another one is an executive at a local company that does a lot of Agile transformations. And so because we've been talking about these things for about a year, many of us have been implementing them here and there, but we're still, we just came out with a book in March, and we're still figuring out exactly how we're going to engage with organizations to do assessments and have conversations with them. So we don't really have any data right now, but we're hoping to collect some. We're actually hoping to do some research and collect some data about applying some of these ideas and helping organizations and hopefully to be more successful. So,
Lisa, I want to thank you as well. Thank you for your
you're very
time and
welcome.
staying up late. Appreciate it.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. It's really no problem. I'm usually up this late anyway. I'm not usually speaking this late, but thank you for bearing with me if I seemed a little tired, but it was really an honor to be asked. I really mean that. And I'm really happy to have been here and looking forward to connecting. I see a couple people made notes. You can find me on LinkedIn and reached out. I'd be happy to, I'll send you my email. You can stay in touch.
Yeah, very good. So thank you, Lisa, for being part of the Agile family and continuing to grow and evolve the Agile family. I'm one of the older people. Ron is older than me, so.
That's okay.
So thank you for evolving. So thank you very much for evolving.
You're very welcome.
And thank you everyone for joining. Again, I'll send out the recording as soon as possible, probably this weekend, and the deck. And we have more people coming up to discuss. I'm sure not as exciting as Lisa. And please reach out to Lisa and her organization. I think this is fundamentally cool stuff that we can all apply and learn from. So again, thank you everyone. And I'm going to say bye-bye.
Bye, take care.
Bye.
Thanks.